A piece of oft-repeated video game trivia is the secret fact that the patriarch of the survival horror genre, Resident Evil, is actually the spiritual sequel to an old NES game that never made it to the West. The story goes that during the mid-90s and the rise of the 5th generation, Capcom was trying to figure out some new IP it could develop to take advantage of Sony's gray foray into the gaming market. A veteran producer at the company, Takuro Fujiwara, presumably seeing the more mature audience that the PlayStation served, pitched going back to some ideas he had had for one of the very first games he had directed for the company, Sweet Home, a horror-themed JRPG set in a haunted mansion. Cut to release, and that fresh take on his old design work becomes Resident Evil, now more of an action game than an RPG of course, but still maintaining a lot of the ideas and evolving a number of mechanics from its cartridge-bound forebear. And that is where a lot of people that roll this factoid out tend to leave things. But a few do go a step further and explain why Resident Evil wasn't just Sweet Home Polygon Edition instead. As with so many painful things in life, the biggest answer to that was likely legal red tape, because Sweet Home was not just some random game Capcom made for the NES, but was rather a movie adaptation of a Japanese horror film by the same name. As such, putting out a sequel to that game, or doing a PSX remake, would require renegotiating the film rights, something that almost certainly wasn't worth the trouble when Capcom could just make a new franchise that it would own outright and not have to share. Given the continued success and piles of money that RE has made over the years, yeah, fair on them to not want to divvy up that pile if they didn't have to. But going back to that movie it's adapted from, that's a part of the story I really don't see people talking very much about. The trivia itself still makes the rounds, of course, now presumably via AI-voiced TikToks instead of badly written listicles, and being Halloween, you'll see plenty of YouTubers and streamers trotting out the fan-translated ROM of the game to gawk at, but I never see anyone talk about that actual source material for that game. Which is especially curious to me, because while their silence might lead you to assume that Sweet Home the movie was just a bog-standard zombie-filled romp, something that shuffles along at least similar lines to Resident Evil, it's absolutely not. Rather, it's a ghost story, one done in that very specific Japanese style that would become all the rage just a decade or so later. Admittedly, getting into nitty-gritty J-horror concepts and film history is probably a bit niche for most, and the game itself and its impact on the medium as a whole is definitely the meat in that oyster, but as a devotee of late-century schlock horror, I wanted the full story. As such, despite this still being a gaming channel, I figured it was about time to put away the controller and break out the popcorn, so we could assess Sweet Home the film on its own merits, pulling it out from under the umbrella and giving this forgotten spectral story its full due. Being a ghost story in that very traditional mold, the premise for Sweet Home is appropriately quite simple. Our story begins with a small TV crew who is visiting an abandoned mansion out in the sticks that once belonged to Ichiro Mamiya, a famous artist specializing in frescoes. He died in recluse and under mysterious circumstances, but rumor holds that he painted one last fresco before he passed on that's been left to rot in his now decrepit family home. As part of a documentary on the local area, our crew is investigating the residence with a mission to find and preserve Mamiya's final work, but local legend says that more lurks in the mansion than some forgotten fine art, as the place is said to be cursed. From there, it's kind of a slow burn as the crew makes their way into the house, finds the fresco, and then makes a number of crucial mistakes that lead to them awakening the dark spirit haunting the place, who turns out to be Ichiro's wife, who's only ever referred to as Lady Mamiya. After the tragic death of her own child, who wandered into the mansion's furnace, the Lady Mamiya did horrific things to cope with that, and in death is now haunting the place, killing any trespassers out of motherly sorrow, rage, and guilt. Once she's been unleashed, the only hope for at least some of our cast to escape is to confront this grief made monstrously manifest by helping her come to terms and pass on. I'm intentionally skipping over a lot of details here that I'll cover more later on. I'm giving all of you who hate spoilers a chance to leave the room now. But in structure, Sweet Home is a very classically laid out ghost story, leaving footsteps in the J-horror mold later followed by movies like Ringu, Ju-on, and One Missed Call. There's that instigating crossing of a forbidden line that attaches the ghost to our protagonists. Said ghost is also the result of deep, often familial trauma in life, born of love and safety corrupted. You then also get the slow build-up, where our protagonists sense something is off, but don't fully grasp the reality of it, despite warnings, generally from a surly old-timer. And then there's the resolution, where as the pace quickens and the protagonists become desperate, they throw themselves into the fray, resolving things by reminding the ghost of their humanity and soothing those old emotional wounds. Sweet Home does lack one common element though, at least in the cut I watched, in the form of a Pyrrhic finale, where it's revealed that despite all of our protagonists' efforts, the curse lives on. But frankly, an actual happy ending for once is far from the end of the world, so I'm not complaining. It should also go without saying that the roots of this structure and stories told in this way are far older than just Sweet Home itself and the relatively modern titles I'm showing here. These same narrative parallels are found both in older examples of Japanese cinema and theater, and go back even further into ancient tales of yokai, curses, and evil spirits that have been told around waning campfires and quiet hearths for centuries. Sweet Home is simply the 1980s incarnation of that ancient storytelling tradition, just told with some of the goopiest gore effects a B-movie budget can muster instead of a set of wooden Hanya masks. And it does use that budget to full effect, both in terms of spending it well on a great-looking set and fantastic practical effects, but also in the sense of those constraints pushing them to do interesting things with cinematography. While the film was distributed by a major studio, Toho, the Godzilla people, it was produced by the much smaller Itami Productions, and they clearly made full use of every dollar they had available, and made do in the cases where that money ran thin. Accordingly, the film has a little bit of an Evil Dead energy to it, where it feels like it was largely filmed in and around an actual mansion, and not just on a series of sound stages. The result is a lot of tight shots and creative angles, where it's clear they're shooting around the actual geography of these rooms, and have limited space to work with as far as cramming the camera and crew in there goes. It makes for a very claustrophobic feeling film at times, which works really well for the material, and it also gives the movie a strong sense of space, as the dimensions of the mansion's rooms feel real. That makes it all the more interesting when things start to go screwy and they use some fun camera tricks to emphasize that. My favorite example being when the reporter character, Asuka, gets possessed early on in the film. They show that subtly at first, by having her shadow act strangely, and then having her unnaturally glide into frame when the lecherous cameraman she's with, Taguchi, starts to realize something is off. Simpler stuff like that gives a nice ramp into when things start going off the rails and the budget kicks in, with the special effects done by the legendary Dick Smith being a standout feature of the film. Smith had previously done makeup for films like The Godfather, Little Big Man, and more relevant for this movie, The Exorcist and Scanners, and his experience shows in the quality of the gore on display. While there are only 3 deaths in the movie, each of them are unique and visually arresting, really shaking things up with just how grotesque they are, and also neatly tying in thematically with the concept of immolation, as that's how both Lady Mamiya and her child died. Things then get kicked up a further notch during the final encounter with the reveal of Lady Mamiya herself, who transforms into this massive ogress, with the souls of the children she had killed budding out of her, trying to escape. It's a fantastic design, and puppeted really well. That said, in movement it does look a little overly puppety at times, and the articulation in the face is decent, but not enough to stop from looking a little derpy when the emotional climax hits, but not enough that those emotions don't come across. Emotions, mind you, which are also handily shown by our cast as well, because despite how thinly the characters might be written, the acting is decent, striking a good balance between hammy and earnest. Admittedly, I'm at somewhat of a disadvantage in my critique of this aspect of the film because my Japanese is elementary at best, but I can understand enough to parse some of the finer details, and let's be honest, chewing the scenery is a universal language. And chew they do, as with all the characters being pretty broad archetypes, the actors are able to fill in the gaps with some very fun performances that show they know what kind of movie they're in. On the more over-the-top side of things, you have the reporter, Asuka, who is portrayed as being a celebrity eccentric right from the start, which adds some misdirection once she gets possessed, and the actress plays both sides of that coin really well. Old Man Yamamura is a similarly fun performance, splitting the difference between crotchety old man and mountain mystic. He's goofily introduced at his service station where he blithely smokes a cigarette while filling up gas canisters, but then goes on to have one of the more gruesome and shocking deaths when he confronts Mamiya directly, with there being a completely out of nowhere but oddly poignant musical number in between. Worth noting as well that he's actually played by the producer, Juzu Itami, in old age makeup, and he's clearly having an absolute fucking ball with it. On the other side of things, though, you have the main trio of the documentary producer Kazuo, his director Akiko, and then Kazuo's daughter Emi. These three characters shoulder the full narrative arc of the movie, with Akiko being the closest thing to a protagonist by the end. And in a story that's supposed to be about family and specifically parental love, their actors do a great job showing that and have solid chemistry together. Kazuo and Emi feel like father and daughter, with their back and forths having that sort of loving antagonism you would expect in that relationship. As for where Akiko fits into that, well, Kazuo is a widower, and while Akiko clearly has a thing for him and she's very close to Emi, there's a reticence in all three of them to move forward there, which all of the actors portray in a subtle but clear way. The character arc that these three share of the movie is really that of Akiko, who is actually played by Itami's wife, a regular staple of his films, stepping into the role of mother for Emi, and them all coming together as a family when it's all said and done. At least, that's how I interpret it. To be blunt though, it really isn't that deep. This is still very much a schlock B horror movie after all, so while it is nice that the actors all deliver solid performances, really all they needed to do was scream. And scream they do. I think throughout the runtime of the film, more or less everyone gets a chance to belt one out, but Emi is the standout as hers quickly raise up to a full-on screech. I could see that turning some people off, as it is quite shrill and you're gonna hear it a bunch, but it does have a realness to it that I actually quite like, compared to the standard scream queen shriek that you'd often hear during that era. Funnily enough, the actress for Emi was actually the lead singer for a famous pop group at the time called Rebecca, so it only makes sense that she'd put those pipes to use here as well. Getting back to the simplicity of the story though, I do think that the more basic narrative largely works in Sweet Home's favor. It is a ghost story after all. It's meant to be simple and a little vague, and this allows them to avoid the pitfall of so many other horror movies that is diving too far into the lore or the mechanics of what's happening. Leaving things more ill-defined as they do and only reciting the broad beats of the campfire version of Mamiya's history, just enough to reinforce themes and provide context, makes it easier for us as an audience to turn our brains off and enjoy the atmosphere and focus on the actual events taking place. Admittedly, following those events at first can be a bit trying, as the pacing of the film overall is somewhat wonky. That's because the first 45 minutes is all set up and it moves quite slowly, with our cast getting situated in the manor, slowly waking up Lady Mamiya, and having the initial whispers of madness set in. While Sweet Home does try to use this time for character building and atmosphere, the characters as written aren't really deep enough to merit it, and the dread could have been deployed more efficiently. That said, I will never begrudge a story for taking the time to properly establish the feelings it's trying to evoke, and giving its narrative a proper ramp into what it wants to do. And it doesn't hurt that you're well rewarded for that slog once you get past it. As soon as they rebury the corpse of Mamiya's child, which Asuka in her craze dug up during the night, that's another great practical effect I dare not show on YouTube, shit immediately starts going off the rails. That's when you get all three of those great gory deaths, that out-of-place but really fun musical number, a bunch of cool ghost shit that shows the situation rapidly dissolving, and Akiko gearing up and confronting the monstrous final form of Lady Mamiya. All bang 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 bang, one after another. In terms of plot progression, Sweet Home is basically a roller coaster ride with just one big slow peak in the middle, and then it's all crashing downhill fun from there. And as blunt as that sounds, it does work. And I think the bombacity acts as a nice contrast to the solemn, darker themes it's trying to work with. That idea of familial love either being monstrously corrupted by abuse and death, or being the shining light that can heal all emotional wounds, is a powerful one. And the movie uses its back half to really push those concepts, which it had just been lightly playing with in the opening half. And it's very much worth noting for context that this was a very popular theme that was starting to pop up in Japanese horror around this time. Specifically, you saw it in relation to femininity and the female side of those family dynamics, which I have read was in response to Japanese feminist movements and theory of the late 20th century, but all of that is so far out of my wheelhouse that it's in the fucking ocean. That said, even without a deeper understanding of all of that particular concept is very much obvious in lots of Sweet Home's later contemporaries. Ringu, Ju-on, Dark Water, One Missed Call, all of these touch on those same painful familial themes with their female leads or with their spectral antagonists. This is also why Twin Peaks, and more specifically its prequel movie, Fire Walk With Me, were huge hits in Japan as well, as the tale of Laura Palmer and Bob fits all that snug like a body bag. Speaking of themes, something else about Sweet Home that absolutely sticks out is its music, specifically its main theme, which sounds like something out of Bloody Dragon Quest. It's chirpy and wistful, and has an 8-bit fairy tale quality to it that is absolutely at odds with the rest of the film, but still works for some reason. And the majority of the soundtrack is like this too, with even the spookier tracks sounding like they should be underlining some low-poly dungeon crawling, and not acting as the lead-up to a bunch of schmucks being grotesquely melted by an angry ghost. In action, it makes for complete and utter tonal whiplash, with whimsy and body horror colliding like two semi-trucks. But I kinda love it. That oral contrast really does give this movie as a whole a very unique vibe moment to moment, and I guess it does kind of fit given the video game version ended up being a JRPG, with even the sound effects kind of fitting that. What's perhaps most interesting about the soundtrack for Sweet Home, though, is who composed it. That's because alongside Sweet Home transitively inspiring a major piece of PlayStation history in Resident Evil, it was also scored by the man who provided a core piece of that system's musical heritage, Masaya Matsuura, the creator of Vibribbon, Jamalami, and Parappa Rappa. At the time, being part of the prog rock / pop duo Size, Sweet Home was, as far as I can tell, his first solo project. And that's pretty much all I know. With a cursory look, I couldn't find much info online about his work on this film specifically. I imagine any interviews with him about it at the time are long rotting on the pages of forgotten magazines, sitting in a Japanese recycling center. But I have to imagine he's proud of it, as the album still exists and is available for streaming on his official Spotify, Apple Music, and SoundCloud pages. So there is that, at least. And while we're talking about the exploits of famous people attached to this movie, I'd be remiss to not cover the major controversy that came up with the film's home video release. That's because the version of Sweet Home that I'm reviewing here today, and that anyone in this day and age will likely see, is not the version that played in Japanese cinemas circa 1988. That theatrical version was approved and, I believe, edited by the film's director and writer, Kiyoshi Kurosawa, whereas after its silver screen run, it was re-edited and in places reshot by the producer, Juzo Itami. Itami's version is the one that Toho then distributed out in '89 on VHS and Laserdisc, much to the anger of Kurosawa, with his version now being lost to time. As a result, Kurosawa did take things to court, suing Itami over the matter, but the judge ended up siding with Itami instead, and at this point the film was both legally and colloquially considered more his than Kurosawa's. While both men went on to have interesting careers after the fact, the circumstances of this lawsuit and of their later lives are probably why the film was never re-released and why Capcom didn't pursue the rights come the time of Resident Evil. For Itami's part, he was already considered somewhat legendary in the Japanese film scene well before Sweet Home, being an actor, screenwriter, producer, and director in numerous projects since the 60s. Around the time of Sweet Home, though, and in the years following it, he was best known for his directorial and screenwriting work, which focused on satirical comedies skewering topics like tax fraud, the Japanese healthcare system, and the Yakuza, with that last one being a sore subject. That's because in 1997, Itami infamously died, on record by suicide, but his family believes otherwise, and comments have been made since that support that doubt and suggest other parties. That being said, his death was hardly the end of his legacy, with there being an award sharing his name established in 2009 that's given it to creatives excelling in any of the myriad fields he worked in, as well as there being a museum in Matsuyama displaying and exploring his various works and the things he loved in life. As for Kurosawa, while Sweet Home was one of his first films, and it likely left a bitter taste in his mouth given the lawsuit, he went on to great things of his own in the decades that followed. Still making movies to this day, his films have since been repeatedly nominated for awards at Cannes, and have gone on to win accolades at a number of other major festivals. And, as you might imagine with such references to the hoity-toity upper crust of the cinematic sphere, his oeuvre has changed somewhat over the years as well. No longer making the V-cinema or pink films he did at the start of his career, which are very roughly the Japanese subgenre equivalent of straight-to-video schlock horror and Skinamax erotic thrillers, he instead took his work in a more highbrow direction, still making thrillers and horror movies, but with a more somber tone and a psychological bent. These later, more serious works have unsurprisingly garnered wider and more international acclaim, though people such as myself will be most aware of his 2001 film Pulse, which received the greatest honor that any foreign film can receive in the West: a dogshit and wholly unnecessary American adaptation. Interestingly, despite their eventual quarrels over the film, both Itami and Kurosawa are fully credited on the game adaptation of Sweet Home, pulling double duty as producer and director, respectively, on that as well. That's because Sweet Home was somewhat intended as a prehistoric example of a transmedia property, where the game and the movie are intended to complement and expand upon one another to some degree. In this particular case, it's essentially with the two being different takes on the same story, with the credit for the game version really going to Takuro Fujiwara, as previously mentioned. Reportedly, Kurosawa told him that he could change any elements of the story that he liked, and after touring the studio and seeing the film, he went wild with it, unrestrained from the arcade design limitations he was used to working within. Not that his arcade efforts are anything to sneeze at, by the way. This was the guy behind cabinet classics such as Ghosts and Goblins and Bionic Commando. But Sweet Home marked his first full console effort, and as such, he was really able to stretch his creative legs in ways he couldn't when tied to the almighty quarter. Mind you, not all the wild stuff he came up with made it in, as anything deemed to not match the atmosphere of the movie was cut, But the end result is a game that distinctly feels like Sweet Home, but is also very much its own beast. It's an early and rare example of a movie tie-in that genuinely feels tied in, and spiritually authentic to its source material, as opposed to its licensed contemporaries being pumped out by companies like LJN.
Ass!
That authenticity and added passion, stemming from the involvement of Itami and Kurosawa, alongside Fujiwara being able to push new boundaries, is also what allowed Sweet Home the game to be as pioneering as it was. All of that talk about it being the grandfather of survival horror isn't just bluster. In many ways, it feels like a digital cave painting, illustrating what would become key facets of that genre. A split party, careful resource management, obtuse inventory puzzles, and a story told largely through atmosphere and scattered notes are all things this game did in an effort to match the feel of the movie. And those things ended up becoming foundational keystones that series like Resident Evil, Silent Hill, and all manner of imitators in the PSX era would build their houses upon. Sure, many of these mechanics feel nearly primordial in Sweet Home. The inventory stuff in particular, as the controls for managing your items are clunky, and it's easy to get soft-locked if you use the limited wood bridge pieces poorly. But the design intent and purpose behind it all is crystal clear. That forward-looking mindset even goes beyond just the survival horror aspect of it as well, as Sweet Home also has very early showings for mechanics like QTEs, multiple endings, character permadeath, and even some very rough Metroidvania-style progression, well before any of those things would really become game design staples. But, as I stated at the start of this video, our focus today is the movie, not the NES game. If you want that, plenty of other people have covered it in more depth if you're interested in learning more. It's just fascinating to see the long-lived legacy of the game, and transitively of the movie as well. And you do see direct callbacks to both the game, and as such the movie, to this day. That classic Resident Evil door opening animation? That wasn't just them hiding loading times, it was a direct callback to when you'd use a key to open a door in the NES game, which in itself is likely a reference to the main house key and the act of entering the mansion that the opening 15 minutes of the film concerns itself with. Different characters with different starting equipment and inherent abilities? Well, before Jill was the master of unlocking, there was Emmy, as each of the core cast you play as in the NES game has a crucial, unique item that they need to repeatedly employ, broadly relating to their actions in the movie. It all just goes to show what can happen when a game strives to not just faithfully adapt a film, but to truly try and evoke it mechanically as well, becoming something unique and interesting in the same spirit as its source material, rather than just a shallow imitation. On the one hand, I can absolutely understand how to an outside audience, even with all the context around it, how Sweet Home would appear unremarkable as a film. Doubly so when you take the game into account and its connection in Resident Evil, as that aspect of things is outwardly the more interesting side of the story. But, as a connoisseur of all things schlock and a lover of B-movies and Japanese culture and all of that, I find a lot to like in Sweet Home, the motion picture. Yeah, the pacing isn't great, the characters are a bit thin, and for as much as I like the score and the sound work, there's some tonal disconnect there. But Sweet Home does do atmosphere really well, and when it's time to lift its skirt and show some gore, it delivers. And even if the writing overall isn't amazing and it leans heavily on cliché and broad archetypes, I think it actually does a decent job carrying on the Japanese ghost story tradition and respectfully plays with deeper themes, touching on parental grief and love in a very sweet sort of way. If you're looking for a good Halloween watch, I would absolutely recommend checking it out, though it is a bit difficult to find properly these days, as it was never redistributed beyond that first home video release. You can find fan sub rips of it floating around, but when it comes to an official release, it seems that Toho, my best guess for who has the rights to it at this point, has decided to keep this one in the vault. And I do understand the reasoning there somewhat, considering the unfortunate high-profile death of Itami, the legal battles between him and Kurosawa surrounding the initial release, and then Kurosawa largely moving on to artier, high-class fare, where Sweet Home doesn't fit as part of his legacy. Put all of those issues and parties together, and there would be a lot of red tape to cut through to make a modern release happen. Regardless, though, if you can track this movie down, it's a very fun watch, taking that well-worn J-horror formula and doing it up with a level of camp that you just don't normally see in these sorts of movies. The same largely goes for the game, and if you're a devotee of the medium's history, then it's worth playing for at least an hour or two just to see such early, nascent versions of all of those mechanics. But the movie really is something special all on its own as well, and deserving of being more than just a forgotten footnote in both cinema and gaming history. And that was Sweet Home, the first proper movie review on the channel. Something I don't think I'm going to do a ton more of, as this is a gaming channel and I have no intention of changing that. The big reason I chose to do this is because, honestly, I've wanted to cover Sweet Home in some capacity for ages, and I only had 6 weeks between when I finished working on the Bureau and when I needed a Halloween episode done, so this made sense as something a little quicker on the turnaround that I could get done more speedily than my usual fare. With Halloween out of the way, though, we're now back on track. And as such, I'll have a coming soon video out sometime next month to let y'all decide what the next big main video is going to be. I was originally going to play with the format for that a little bit, maybe do like a themed vote, but given the insane growth of the channel over the last month and a half, I'm going to stick with the original format so everybody who's new can see how the process works and get their first crack at it. I'll see y'all back next month for that, or if you're a supporter on Ko-Fi, stick around, because the regular monthly podcast for supporters should be dropping tomorrow, or sometime this week, depending on how much effort it took me to get this Halloween video out on time. Either way though, hope you enjoyed this video, hope you enjoy the next one, and I hope you have a wonderfully spooky and happy Halloween. Have a good one, everybody.